I am very excited about today's presenter. I've had the pleasure of attending a previous talk by Laurien Nuss, or Lala Nuss. Was born and raised and educated on Oahu and Mokuokiawe, Hawaii. She recently joined the City and County of Honolulu's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resilience as a Climate Resilience and Equity Manager. Lala is dedicated to recultivating community resilience and well-being through the practice of regenerative relationships. She continues to cultivate the practice of interweaving corporate and grassroots, island and global perspectives in holistic approaches to centering equitable emergent solutions, genuinely reflective of and appropriate to people and place. An advocate and educator in sustainable tourism, Lala is dedicated to the rehabilitation of our primary forms of true Waiwai in ecological, cultural, social, and spiritual well-being. Please welcome Lala Nuss.
Aloha, everyone. Aloha mai kako. Mahalo nui to Mike and April and everyone who supported bringing us together in this space today. And to everyone who made time to be here today. Mahalo for being here. Before we get going, I want to share a little bit in this space in the spirit of bringing our beloved places and communities into this space today. So we're going to do a hopeful, fun virtual activity. Some of you may have practiced this already, but we want to do a quick 2-question poll. Before that, I would love everyone to use the chat. And if you can name or drop into the chat the aina and place you call home, and one person, past, present, or future, you want to bring into the space today. So feel free to drop that into the chat when you feel inspired to do so. But in the absence of us being able to physically be in each other's space and really wanting to center around our pilina and relationships to people and place, the chat box is the option we have on the virtual world. So we'd love to see where everyone's coming from and who they're bringing in the space today. Kukani loko, mahalo, Amy. So good to see you, your daughter. Mahalo, I'm seeing them coming in now. Manuatele, mahalo. Afina. Eva Beach. That's where I'm at right now. My ka'i. Mahalo, yeah, please feel free to just bring in those place names and people into the space. And mahalo for bringing that. Before I get going officially on the presentation and talk story I'll be supporting today, want to do a poll now. So the first question, and we'll have 2, we'll do them separately, is how much do you incorporate equity into your work and practice? And so this is an anonymous poll, so feel free to be honest as much as possible. So we can kind of get a temperature gauge for how centered and how much we're thinking about equity in our work for those that are in the room today, just so I can get an idea of who's in the audience. Nice. Loving seeing that so many in the space. Letter A, my ka'i. So for a lot of us, equity is a foundation of our work. I'm excited to hear that, and I'm excited to share on what that looks like in my world, and hopefully have some Q&A and conversation around what that looks like in your worlds as well. All right, so we're going to end the poll, that question. Our next question is, what kind of relationship understanding do you have about or with community issues related to your work? Historical and contemporary. What kind of relationship and understanding do you have about and with your community issues related to your work? Nice. Seeing everything come in, and hopefully you're seeing it on your screen as well. So it's good to see that no one has chosen C, at least in my opinion. Everyone has some type of baseline, And it seems kind of in the middle. So we have somewhat of an understanding and relationship. My ka'i. Mahalo, everyone. Okay. Awesome. So I think we can move into our presentation now. All right, thank you everyone for just kind of getting into the space. I'm such a face-to-face and connector, so I'm trying to find inspiring ways to be able to still connect with everyone. So um, based off of that, what are we going to talk about today? So a little bit about my background, as Mike kind of covered already. Um, but I want to put forth that I'm in no way an expert in the area of water or law. I am, though, a practitioner, advocate, and lifelong learner within the nexus of environmental and social justice movements, challenges, and possibilities. Today's presentation and Q&A time, talk story, hopefully is really meant to be focused on telling a story centered on what equity, historical, and present day context are inviting and challenging us to deepen in, really within our abilities to transform patterns and realities that are no longer appropriate for the needs of our times in many ways. And while hopefully providing insight into expanding the emergent possibilities already embodied in practice within our own beloved communities. You can go into the next slide, please. So a little bit of background on the office. I'll run through this pretty quickly and then dive into some of the deeper context. As many of you, I hope, are familiar with, the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency was mandated by Oahu voters in 2016 and established in 2017. As you can see on the slide, these are some of the areas of our kuleana and responsibilities within our jurisdiction that we're holding for the city. And my role, of course, is within the Climate Resilience and Equity Program. Next slide, please. We can see from this org chart kind of where we sit within the ecosystem of the city and county of Honolulu. It really is an ecosystem of what is critical for our city to function in many ways, right? And our kuleana is really focused on policy plans, strategies, knowledge, and programs specific to climate change adaptation and mitigation endeavors. And just a little inkling into what we did during COVID as far as adaptability, we helped stand up the call center and One Oahu website, as well as took the initial CARES funding that we received through our office to help establish and redesign what once was the Office of Economic Development into now what is the Office of Economic Revitalization, which is going to play a key role, not just for our COVID recovery, but as well as our climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts. Next slide, please. So our office prides itself in prioritizing improving community engagement and input. If some of you are familiar with the community resilience, Ola resilience strategy, that took us 2 years of process in creating that strategy. And you can see from some of the numbers here, how many and who we engaged with, and really some of the feedback of what community reflected to us in regards to this resilience strategy. Next slide, please. Within that Oahu Ola resilience strategy, the 4 pillars and 44 actions that came out of it, you can see there the 4 pillars of remaining rooted, bouncing forward, climate security, and community cohesion. And within the pillars, our equity program is really honing into pillars 1 and 4. Although equity is meant to be an overarching and centering component for which we consider all 44 actions within the strategy. And you can see here really the landscape. Climate change is predicted to affect everything in our lives. And so too, the concept of equity is meant to be looking at everything, all sectors, all kuleana, from a lens of equity. And so we're learning how to do that within the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. Next slide, please. A little bit about just some quick bills and information regarding some of the amazing efforts that's taken place through our office. Bill 65 was just passed at the end of last year. Mahalo to everyone who supported in the efforts and contributed to time and testimony. It was somewhat of a challenge to get this passed, and we couldn't have done it without our community partnerships and relationships. And you can see the ordinance covers quite a breadth and depth of what our office is meant to have kuleana and lead in throughout the city and county of Honolulu. Next slide, please. Some more specifics on where we're moving now. We came out with the Ola Resilience Strategy, and our work continues on even through COVID. The CAP, or Climate Action Plan, is something that has been initially finalized into the next 1 to 5 years of implementation. And so I definitely invite you into checking out the website there, the link below, to be able to check out more details on the Climate Action Plan. That's really looking at mitigation efforts focused on energy, transportation, carbon sequestration. Next slide, please. And our other large-scale project we have is a Climate Ready Oahu, and this is really looking at adaptation strategy. And as you can see here, you think about the climate events that are predicted to take place. And that too is actually happening right now. We're in the process of creating it. And there are quite a few opportunities to engage online, virtually right now through surveys or community meetings. And we are learning and pushing ourselves to be able to be increasingly accessible given the constraints of being able to gather and having a multitude of ways of reaching out to community with different needs. And you can see the website there as well. Please feel free to visit these projects. And again, we're resources for any questions you may have. Next slide, please. So Climate Resilience and Equity Program, what is that? From this slide, you can see we've kind of created our own 4 pillars, really rooting in access, agency, and advocacy within our communities to increase participation and representation through the work we're doing. Again, this cross-pollination of where equity is meant to be embedded and centered within all the different aspects of our work. And these are kind of the 4 pillars of community relationships, environmental justice, equitable governance, and aligning with adaptation and mitigation efforts. Next, please. Some definitions that I think are important to center us on, as language is critical to understanding ourselves, each other, and where we're going. So this definition, the term resilience, can be thrown around a lot or watered down a bit or just misunderstood. And it's not always about disasters. This definition here is something that the Rockefeller Foundation through the 100 Resilient Cities and now Bloomberg have adopted. And so this is what started our office within a context of resilience understanding. Next slide, please. And then equity. What does equity mean? Another nuanced term that can be used in many different frameworks. But equity in climate change means both protection from environmental hazards and access to environmental benefits at the end of the day. Part of this is it really is a process. It's not something that's stagnant, it's iterative and emergent. And that's something that for large institutions, we're figuring out how to do as we need to expand our capacities and abilities. Part of this is really acknowledging historical inequitable system or systemic practices and ongoing patterns that have been inherited and cause adversity, harm, and marginalization experienced by certain groups of people. In a critical practice, again, a practice to move towards increased equitable outcomes in both social and environmental justice initiatives. Going around and sitting with community and mentors and kupuna and keiki alike, saying like, what is a word we would use in Hawaii that represents equity? And repeatedly the word pono was brought forth. And this idea, I stole this from Urban Sustainability Directors Network, moving at the speed of trust. That's a space that we are challenged by, and this need to quickly move through adaptation and mitigation efforts. How do we do that at the speed of trust when we are realizing there's a lot of mistrust and a growing mistrust between government and communities? So this is really a critical nexus point for us to dive into. Next slide, please. So to kind of start framing us a bit more, and I promise we'll close out with our definition soon, but I think it's critical because I think we're still really learning and leaning into the space of how is equity a part of our lives, whether in institutions, personally or professionally. But these are kind of a national framework of 5 dimensions of equity. You have procedural, and I won't read through all of them, but we're looking at processes through procedural, and examples there you can see around, it's not the what, but the how we're doing things, in which equity really brings forth its practice and demonstration in many ways. So whether it's procedural, distributional, structural, transgenerational, and a new one that's been brought into the room that I think is very significant to Hawaii is cultural. And it really requires centering community needs and building social equity into the very fabric of policies, programs, and processes. Next slide, please. And this is a term that myself and many others, that geek out in the environmental justice or even sustainability offices around the country, are really excited by or intrigued by is a good friend and colleague, Rocky Mulder, who was in the energy office or energy program at our office, was like, yes, targeted universalism. And this was introduced by Berkeley professor John A. Powell and the Othering and Belonging Institute. And it sets, universal goals for the general population that are accomplished through targeted approaches based on the needs of different groups. It leads to, ideally, and in many spaces, not just ideally, but through case studies and actual scientific methodology, proving that this type of process and frameworking and then practice really leads to decreasing harm and increasing well-being for the social, cultural, and ecological diversity of a particular people and place. Next slide, please. Another word that gets used a lot, and we heard that quite a bit during COVID, on who our frontline workers, who our frontline community members are. And in the context of climate change, they're actually not quite different. Frontline communities include lower income communities, communities of color, indigenous peoples, and immigrant communities, just to name a few. Although you can see from the list at the bottom of the slide, frontline communities have can be a range of vulnerabilities, being experienced vulnerabilities to be considered. These communities, more than not, suffer first and worst from climate disaster or shocks, as well as the ongoing chronic stressors that have been experienced pre and post shocks. This is, really due to decades of underinvested and unjust systems that have left these communities with disproportionately high costs for energy, transportation, and basic necessities. Limited access to public services, high levels of poverty and pollution, and outdated and weak critical infrastructure. The highly exposed to climate risks, as well as having fewer resources, capacity, safety nets, or political power to respond, are ingredients that are causing increased adversity with the onset of climate change. An example of that, say on the Waiwai coast, it's predicted for heat and drought to rise significantly over the next 30 years. What's that going to do to our communities that are already struggling to cover their utility costs and now needing air conditioning in order to stay healthy and cool in their homes? Next slide, please. And to kind of ground us a bit more on these systems that we've inherited in many ways in order to really understand how we want to move within the space of equity. This is a framework that I've used and many others have used within social justice and environmental justice spaces around the pillars of systemic inequity. And those really are looking at, genocide and colonialism, slavery and capitalism, Orientalism, and war in many ways. And this slide deck will be available for everyone in case you're interested, because I'm going to run through this probably a little more quickly than I would, just to give space to talk a bit more. But these are starting to look at holistic approaches of how did we get here? What have we inherited? What is no longer working or was never working for a significantly growing larger population? Next slide, please. Another term that really needs to, I feel, centered within the equity framework is our current economic system and what we've inherited from that space, and acknowledging the racial issues within that. That said, a person of any race might engage in racial capitalism, as might an institution dominated by one particular race. And in Hawaii, we have a really unique story. It is different from the continental context, but in many ways comes from the same core root cause. It reminds us that all capitalism is influenced by racism in one way or another. It suggests that capital can only be capital when it is accumulating wealth to some groups. And it only is accumulated by power and control in many ways. Next slide, please. So centering a little bit more on Hawaii and the specifics here, in which how do we really start, some of this is uncomfortable, and I want to acknowledge that. We're still finding our language and our comfort levels within larger institutions to really unpack our histories in order to really understand where we're at today in order to be able to move forward. And these are some more frameworks that I really want us to acknowledge within the Hawaii context, looking at settler colonialism, militarism, and tourism, these isms. And settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with a settler society that over time develops a distinct superior identity and power over the resources, which are land and labor. And militarism is a belief of, or the desire of a government or people, that a state should maintain a strong military capacity and to use it aggressively to expand national interest and our values. And these images here depict some of the historical experiences that have happened in Hawaii, whether it's Iolani Palace during the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian nation, Waikiki Beach, the infamous Royal Hawaiian Hotel during World War II, when the US military took over Waikiki. And also remember, Waikiki was originally a thriving wetlands that produced significant amount of food, as well as a retreat space for royal families before being drained into the Alawai Canal and filled in to develop what now is our mass tourism mecca of the Pacific. And that poster there is from Kalama Valley, which was a historical struggle in the 70s, that essentially displaced BIPOC subsistence farmers to make way for market rate residential development. These are all examples of kind of the isms that we still have. We may not have created them, but we have inherited them. Next slide, please. Getting to a little bit more of the topic around water and what does, environmental justice and water look like within the US context. So these are 3 examples here. I think many know about the Flint water crisis. And again, understanding the isms around this, right? And this patterning of how come a certain type of people continue to suffer the most despite many different adversities or experiences, whether it's shocks or stressors. With Flint, the city switched its drinking water supply from Detroit systems to the Flint River in a cost-saving move. Inadequate treatment and testing of the water resulted in a series of major water quality and health issues for Flint residents. We can look at the Dakota Access pipelines and the Standing Rock Sioux Tribes movement to protect their water supply and sacred land from the privatized crude oil pipeline that threatens catastrophic damage for their lands, drinking water, and ancient burial grounds. And what's happening right now as we speak in Texas. In addition to the crippling power outages, 13 million Texans, about half of the state's population, also lack clean drinking water. And state authorities ordered 7 million people to boil tap water before drinking it because of the catastrophe going on with the infrastructure and our pipes there. Next slide, please. Taking it back a little bit to Hawaii and looking at some of the policies that have taken place around water here over the last century. During the Kingdom era, an emergent group of Western businessmen built power by accumulating wealth through the commodification of sugar. Sugar was a centralized and racialized plantation industry. And if any of you are familiar with the rice ditch, in 1856. The ditch allowed the very first transfer of water outside of natural watershed in Hawaii. Missionary descendants William H. Rice and the Lihui plantation sought to move water to irrigate its sugar plantations. The move was billed as a success and became a model for planters to move water to sugar fields on drier parts of the islands and away from valleys where Kanaka had historically grown kalo and other crops for subsistence. You can see there on the right-hand side, the kind of racial breakdown of power structure, hierarchy within the plantation era. Next slide, please. Another one that I want to bring to light is the Waihole Waikane, and many of you may be familiar with this. And a little bit of information going back within that Aina, when again during the time of the sugarcane plantations in the 1916 and beyond, 30 million gallons of water, stream water per day was moved into sugarcane plantations. While the acreage in wetland crops and taro and rice fell by 90% during this time after construction, many tenants continued to grow sweet potato, breadfruit, bananas, and papaya for home consumption, for sharing, and for sale. In the 70s, the Waihole Waikane Valley produced 82% of Oahu's sweet potatoes and 30% of the island's papaya. And you can see a little bit of information here around what happened in the 1970s. And this was, again, looking at displacement of subsistence living to be able to look at development. When the plantation shut down in 1994, a long battle over the water began. And local residents were able to win back over half of the water, which benefited the entire ecosystem. And this really did pave the way for other stream restoration efforts that we're seeing, emerging left and right throughout Hawaii today. Still a struggle, but we've seen a lot of progress. Next slide, please. Another environmental justice space on the island of Oahu, and forgive me, I am very Oahu specific, just because that is our jurisdiction, but I promise you can find these patterns on almost every island. Looking at the Navy base, I come from Honolulu and Hilo, and I'm currently sitting in Ahupua'a and Moko of Ewa. And really looking at what Pearl Harbor did when we're talking about militarism, right? And in establishing Pearl Harbor in 1908, pre-contact Pu'uloa was a primary food production area and a seat of political power for the island of Oahu. Mo'olelo research also confirms that Pu'uloa is one of Ewa's most significant resources. Large numbers of local i'a that produce healthy awa or fish milk or mullet, akule, and pipi or oysters, among other marine resources. On land in Ewa, when I was little, was still all sugarcane. Now it's all houses. But way before mine time, the kai variety of kalo was said to be some of the most ono on Oahu, and that came out of Ewa. The abundant punawai of Ewa contributed to rich lo'i kalo and provided fresh water for other production food systems in the region. And as we can see over the years, taking it from 1873, where these types of systems were still well recorded and intact, up into present day, um, there's been monumental change. And there's also been significant efforts to look at restorative practices within this space. Next slide, please. This is another one when we're talking about water for the island of Oahu is Kapukakahi. And that's Red Hill, or the fuel tank, which is in the moku of Ewa, I believe, within that district. So not far from where we were talking about Pu'uloa. But this has been an ongoing battle for many years, and something that is really significant. More than 250 million gallons of fuel just 100 feet above Oahu's primary drinking water supply is the current situation where we're dealing with here. Sierra Club has been a force to be reckoned with in many ways in really looking at this issue and challenge that we're facing. And there is a lot of controversy and sensitivity around this topic, but it is something that I encourage more of us to understand. You know, one of the basic uh, identities or spaces in which, you know, from a Hawaiian worldview is, where's your water? What waters do you come from? And specifically the waters that are being threatened in this space um, provide drinking water from that area all the way through Hawaii Kai. So a significant population are under threat should something happen. Next slide, please. So with all of that bad news, what are we doing about it? And what are others doing about it? I love this graphic. This is an inspiration that I've been moving in with the Movement Strategy Center. You know, it's a framework for cities to reorganize resources, foster meaningful relationships, and develop place-based innovations that support all people to thrive despite climate disruption. So we're looking at how do we face and acknowledge the realities of the systemic and unjust patterns that have been established in one way or another, and what's happening and how can we move towards a more restorative, regenerative place of well-being for a larger population. Next slide, please. This is another resource, and I'll be providing now a lot of different resources that I hope are helpful. I think for me, that's always helpful when I'm given a bunch of different stuff to go check out, because this is relevant in some way, shape, or form to the work you're doing. But the Green Lining Institute has put together Making Equity Real in Climate Adaptation and Community Resilience Policies and Programs. This is an amazing guidebook that we're starting to marinate and chew on a bit more within our office. And within these four spaces, you know, embedding equity in the mission, vision, and values, we're taking it from a space of nuanced, putting equity into words and great ideas, and actually starting to practice where the rubber meets the road and operationalizing and implementation aspects of what equity looks like. So, you know, policies and grant programs should explicitly state a commitment to equity and specifically identify the vulnerable populations they seek to benefit. You know, building equity into the process. Again, this process, right? How do we build capacity to even move in those processes in a more intentional way? They should really deeply engage community members so as to learn about their priorities, needs, and challenges to adapting to climate impacts. You know, the information gathered should inform the development and implementation of the policy or grant program. So what we're really looking at is going from a very hierarchical structure, top down, and starting to want to balance it out with a bottom up. And how do we start investing in and practicing in more of these spaces of engagement where communities are helping and intentionally influencing the decisions that are made on institutional levels? You know, ensuring equity outcomes, the implementation. This is key, key, key. And this is where we're looking at the CAP, or the Climate Action Plan, over the next 5 years, is really looking at the policy and grant programs that must lead to equity outcomes. So how are we demonstrating it, right? That are really responding to community needs, that are reducing vulnerability and increase community resilience. And the last one is the analysis. This is another one where a lot of us fall short, is how do we assess that what we were supposed to do, we carried out through? Again, an iterative ongoing process where policies and grant programs should regularly evaluate their equity successes and challenges to improve the efforts going forward. This is not meant to be perfect work. This is meant to be work that we all start embracing and leaning into within appropriate capacities in our own spaces. And this is a space we need to learn together in. Next step, please, or next slide. Another city I really want to uplift, maybe I want to uplift them because it's a local girl that's been really leading the charge in King County. I've had the fortunate privilege and opportunity to be amongst national cohort of progressive cities and their sustainability offices throughout the US and Canada, actually. And I've become really good friends with Jamie Strobel, who has been doing environmental justice and climate equity work for the past 15 years out of Seattle or King County. And this is some of the framework. They have a climate action plan, but what they've done is expanded it even further. Again, this iterative process of saying, okay, we got a climate action plan. Now, is it suffice when we're talking about equity? And they stepped up and really created this robust, not just a plan, but a practice and a process in order to hold themselves accountable to be able to do the work. Next slide, please. So here in Hawaii, and I'll wrap it up in about 5 minutes or so, and then open up maybe 20 or 15 minutes for some Q&A. But uplifting what's happening here in Hawaii. There's the Climate Change, Adaptation, and Mitigation Commission for the state of Hawaii. And in 2019, they came out with an equity statement. And I think this is probably one of the most progressive statements I've seen on a local level or on a Hawaii level in regards to equity and climate change initiatives and where we want to go with it. And the acknowledgement of indigenous voices, cultural responsiveness, being kind of at the core of what equity is for us here in Hawaii within our unique and very diverse circumstances. And acknowledging that we still have a living, expanding, incredibly important indigenous population here. Our root culture is very significant to how we move forward within our adaptation and mitigation efforts. Next slide, please. Another component that keeps coming up and is being asked about and that I've been learning in is research methodology. Really reflecting or critiquing what type of research, what type of data are we looking at right now? And from a very I guess you could say, place-based community advocacy space, there was a lot of data that I wasn't seeing that really wasn't reflecting the voices or experiences of the communities that I've worked with and come from. And so I started diving into looking for expansive forms of research methodology that I thought was more aligned and more encompassing and inclusive of not just the quantitative or quantitative framework, but bringing in qualitative aspects to really balance our approaches to the solutions we're needing to figure out together. And so you can see the list there. CREA Hawaii is Auntie Puanani Borges has been a significant influence in my reflections in my own work that keeps grounding me to be very place-based in the work we're doing. And this is some of the recommendations they've had around their assessments through research. And below that is a list and live links to some of the practices or even articles that I recommend reading regarding methodology. The local needs assessment that just came out of Paipai Oheia that Dr. Rosie Allegado has helped complete is profoundly revealing on the type of engagement, data, and information that we have the capacity to bring forth in our decision making today. Next slide, please. and just a quick overview of national and local best practices. I think this is something that is significant as well to start bringing in together what's happening at a national level and where are intersections and relatability between that and the locality of place. So our office is a member of Government Alliance on Race and Equity, as well as with Urban Sustainability Directors Network that have significant programs focused on equity and climate change. Again, that movement generation, justice and ecology project that I mentioned earlier is a great one. And then uplifting some of our local organizations that have been doing this work way before I have, as well as at the bottom, you see three significant movements that I think are, or four of them that I think are important to consider, whether we're talking about the Institute for Climate and Peace, which really looks at national and international perspectives, but is housed in Hawaii, or the Aina Aloha Economics Future, that is really looking at recovery from a cultural perspective that is just, equitable, and inclusive of our ecological frameworks. Next slide, please. And we got one or two more, and then we'll open it up for conversation. And then just some initiatives that our office has been moving in specific to the equity program. I've been in my role for about 1.5 years now. And these are some of the, I guess, things you could say we have to show for ourselves, for lack of a better word. And all of these too have live links to dive deeper into for those that are interested. But again, looking at everything from taking cares funding that we had to use within 2 months, and being able to create affordable, food security scaping projects for the city's affordable housing properties. Like, how can we do more of that? Resolutions, looking at a socially just and equitable recovery, centering on that as we reinvest, and hopefully move to a place of more stability in a more pono and equitable way. Next slide, please. This idea of a recovery initiative and what the revealing and realities and possibilities are that COVID has had us discover, and the connections they have between climate change. These are some of throughout community engagement during COVID that we participated in, and saying how can we contribute and support our leadership in designing a just and equitable community within a recovery standpoint, economically and otherwise. These were kind of the four frameworks that community kept bringing to the table for us to really hone in on. And last slide. And I'll close it out with just rooting in, our social, cultural, ecological intelligence, knowledge, technology, and abilities. Wanting to really reinforce that we have a unique story to tell and a unique capacity here and capability in Hawaii, unlike any place else in the world. And that symbiotic, regenerative relationship in how we manage our natural resources and economy is right there. It really is a lot closer than we think. And that I want to kind of close out in emphasizing the critical need to continue to expand beyond our boundaries of what we consider expertise and ability. What is vulnerability versus resilience? And how can we bring more people into the room to have that conversation and help us and guide us make those decisions? So I'll stop there. Mahalo, everyone. I hope something resonated with you throughout this presentation, and want to open it up for any questions anyone may have. Mahalo nui again.
Mahalo, Lala. Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. I'm very excited for our Q&A. So I'll start. There's a couple questions that we had cataloged and comments. Let's see. The first one was Sierra Club of Hawaii. This is very powerful. Mahalo for centering racial capitalism, intersectional injustices in the context of Hawaii's colonial history. Let's see.
There's so much good stuff on here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to. If you want to go through the chat, please, and I can let you lead that, just so I don't bog you down here.
No worries. Okay. I don't want to miss anything. We need like another half an hour to talk story now. Um, Mahalo, Victoria. Good to have you on here. Um, I'm not sure if I'm seeing any questions. I'm seeing a lot of responses.
Well, you know what? I'll start off with a question for you.
Kiki.
Uh, since you're talking to the Water Resources Research Center and a bunch of researchers, how can our researchers really, aside from a lot of the materials that you provided, understand the context of incorporating equity in their research? So really to feel that, not only to just read it and kind of absorb that, but really kind of how can they center themselves in that, so that when they're doing research in the community, they're making sure that they're taking into consideration all the important aspects that you brought up.
Yeah, and I'll acknowledge this is a challenge because our current forms and systems haven't really, I think, expanded to the need and potential we have to do research even in equitable ways. Like we got to understand, many of our institutions are still coming from a very Western linear framework of science and knowledge. It's significant and incredibly important. And also, how are we bringing in cultural place-based perspectives? Um, some of those resources I put on there, I think, are critical to take into consideration around the processes. Um, for example, when I got to work with the Honolulu Climate Commission, um, when they were working on their equity brief, it was in the middle of COVID, and we were, the options to do engagement were limited. But because I've had relationship with community in many ways, I said, would it be helpful if we did a focus group, right? How do we get more qualitative content and relational information to us from a very academic institutional research setting? And so we were able to, maybe not in the, if we had more opportunity, the ideal space that we would work in would be completely different. But even that step is really important, is how are we relating? How are we bringing in representation from the communities that we're looking at from a database, right? How are we, as Matt Lynch puts it, naming, nourishing, and illuminating the lives and experiences of the numbers? What are the names behind the numbers of our data? So really looking at the qualitative practices and processes, I think, is critical. And Dr. Kuka Hakalau has a whole methodology around Kanaka research and looking to the source. Like, how do we start looking at those types of research from a Kanaka lens in order to incorporate it into different settings of research and methodology, which are critical to this place? I hope that's a little helpful. Victoria has a question, and the question is, what are your thoughts on how we can make tourism in Hawaii more equitable in terms of impacts and benefits? She says, I worry that we are losing the opportunity from the current crisis to start diversifying and transforming our economy. Yeah, I worry about that too, Victoria. With having had I grew up, my parents worked for Pan Am, so I was in my mama's belly while I was flying around the world, and then got into it as a professional career and was in mass tourism. So this definitely is a important topic for me. There's models out there around regenerative tourism. And I know that sounds like a really fancy word, but if we start looking at regenerative economics, looking at those systems and the approaches and processes, how can we better balance out the intake versus the outtake, right? And there's a million ways of doing that. I'm being kind of high level now, but one example, and I just sent in testimony for the regenerative tourism bill that's being pushed through around like what how can we do this differently? It can be through policy, it can be through investment. When I left the tourism industry, I founded Conscious Concepts, and I basically got sick of the extractive economic model that my beloved tourism industry, that realization of like, oh, coming home and seeing how extractive it was to my people in place, and said, I've been around the world and there's so many different models of a more regenerative relationship between a visitor and a host or root culture. And that really is like, how can we take the $19.6 billion that are flowing into the economy, and having more of it distribute through and stay in and circulate local economy? That could be as simple as mandatory hotels, restaurants have to source 30% of their food produce from local farms. That could be looking at carbon taxes for tourist automobiles here, right? Um, that could be looking at um, making it mandatory for locally owned businesses to have products in gift shops, to have guides, tourist guides, be from Hawaii, right? That's another issue where a lot of people weren't from Hawaii, but they were coming here and establishing, being a tour guide for a place. Like, how are they finding that information? So there's a million ways, and I'm more than happy to send you that 33 ideas I had that I submitted if you're interested. We have another question from Kai Nishiki. What are your thoughts on utilizing fish ponds instead of seawalls, or in conjunction with beach nourishment and or groins? I don't know if that was a misspell, that last question there. That's a really good question. Again, I'm not an expert within coastal or water programs or sector or study. But if, we're looking at seawalls and the destruction that it's causing around beach erosion and coastal erosion, how could we come up with a regenerative way for an alternative that is multifaceted and holistic? I love that idea. I would love to see, like, what do you have a location directly that you're thinking of where you could pilot something like this? How could we reestablish local that have been taken away because of development today? Like, what would Waikiki look like again if, say, the golf course turned into a wetlands, right? If we're talking about that whole Alawai project. And Sean Connolly's doing epic work in that space that I recommend checking out.
If Kai is available, she can, or they can expand on that question if they'd like to.
Hi, thank you for taking questions. The last part of the question was tea groins, and tea groins are basically jetties that go out into the water, and they are being proposed here at Kahana Bay. And some of our community members had just asked, well, what if instead of jetties that just went straight, they actually took more on the shape of a traditional fish pond? But then, there's questions about, well, is that appropriate in an area where there wasn't historically fish ponds? And is it culturally insensitive to propose a solution like this for erosion and sea level rise? And then there's also the issue of, well, most of these proposals are happening in high tourist areas, and it's basically protection for the resorts. So while it might be an interesting proposal, what's happening landward needs to be addressed as well, such as resorts built on sand dunes, and that they need to move back. And we can also maybe do the fish ponds, but thank you.
Mahalo for that, Kai. Thank you. And I learned something from you today around tea grinds. I didn't know that term and what you described. And you're asking good questions. Is this culturally appropriate? Does this make sense in a place where historically there was no fish pond? How is it that these are being thought about in really high commercialized areas? And what is the investment being done in economic, economic engine saving versus community well-being, right? Where there maybe isn't as much consumption taking place. These are really important questions. It would be interesting. I think Hi'ile comes to mind from Pai Oheia, like sitting down and having a talk story with her around this idea. Like, what would you think, Tita, if like we had fish ponds instead of seawalls? And what would that look like in Waikiki or in community areas that historically haven't had fish ponds there? Like, the fish ponds are there for an ecological design reason, right? So what would creating a fish pond that wasn't there that would maybe be appropriate there now? I don't know. That's really good questions, Kai. I would love to talk story more about that. I know we're pretty much almost at time, Mike. So I don't know if
Yeah, unfortunately, so there's actually some good questions, or another question, but also a comment regarding the fish ponds. And they were saying that they usually built around freshwater springs, so they might not work in place of a tea growing where there were no freshwater springs. And they left their email if anyone would like to ask more questions or check out their work on Oahu fish ponds. But I just want to thank everyone for coming. And Monique had a question, but we'll send that along to Lala and have that answered for you. But I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Lala, again. I think this really helped inform things that we need to understand as we move forward as researchers, community members, all of us. So I can't thank you enough, and I look forward to hopefully hosting you again.
Mahalo nui, Mike, and mahalo everyone for coming to this space and sharing and listening to me talk for 40 minutes. I did drop my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out. Mike will send on that presentation, and I'm happy to dial in. There's some stuff on here on that chat, Mike, that I'd love to check out as well. So would love for that
Absolutely.
to be seen.
We'll save
Mahalo
that.
nui,
Yeah.
everyone.
And one last thing, I don't know if Tom, our director, wanted to say any parting words, but I'll let him do that.
Yeah.
If you.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Mike, for coordinating this and for lining up this great speaker. And thanks to April and others who help out to make this work, and all the participants today. Thank you for joining, but especially thank you, Lala. Really nice to meet you, and look forward to meeting you in person. A great talk. You gave us, all of us on the science side, a lot to think about, and we really appreciate it. So thanks very much.
Mahalo nui, everyone. Take good care. Aloha.